So last class we were talking about the theory of utilitarianism, and what we were doing is trying to learn how to think the way a utilitarian thinks. And as you may recall, I pointed out that there are a number of different criteria that the utilitarian asks us to consider whenever we're making a decision. The overarching theme of all of these criteria, however, is just this: you have to consider the big picture when it comes to making an important decision. You have to think about the long-term implications and consequences of your actions, not just for yourself, but for every possible party involved. Keep in mind, too, the utilitarian, they're trying to produce the most total happiness in the world, even if sometimes that doesn't produce the total number of happy people. And what we did last class is we started to look at one important controversial issue, that is the legalization of marijuana, to see what the utilitarian would say about this. You might recall that I had said that James Rachels, in the reading, he argues that the utilitarian would be in favor of legalizing marijuana because it would produce the most happiness in the world. I'm not so certain about that. I think it's a more complicated question than what Rachels presents. But at the end of the day, the utilitarian's view is motivated solely by whether legalizing it would produce the total happiness in the world or it would produce more overall pain than happiness. And the utilitarian is going to side for whichever one produces the greatest net consequences. One thing I pointed out is that they are not motivated at all by arguments such as the following: it's my body, my right, the government therefore has no right to tell me what I can and can't put into my body. The utilitarians are not concerned for that kind of argument. They're not concerned about protecting your personal rights per se. What they're concerned about with is producing the total amount of happiness in the world. What we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to continue talking about a couple of key controversial issues just so you can see exactly how the utilitarian would reason about these. As I said in last class, the utilitarian is going to probably recommend some revisions in your ordinary ways of thinking about things. And these might be acceptable just so long as the revisions that they suggest aren't too crazy. They're not too different from what are our ordinary shared core moral beliefs, you might say. And we're going to begin by looking at the issue of criminal punishment. Now, when I'm talking about criminal punishment, I don't mean necessarily capital punishment. That's one form of punishment, but we also punish people in various other ways. We write tickets for them, we put them on probation, we make them do community service, and we lock them in prison. So there are different forms of punishment, and currently the U.S. has one of the, if not the, largest prison population in the entire world. The U.S. is very, very tough on punishment. And it's a good philosophical question to ask yourself: what justifies punishing people for their crimes? What gives society the right to take away someone's freedom? What gives society the right to execute someone or to make them pay a penalty for something that they've done? And there are a lot of common answers that people provide here, and I'm just going to list some of these right now. And one of the most common reasons that people cite is just simply this idea that criminals deserve to pay for what they have done. Now, maybe this isn't something that you have strong feelings about when it comes to something like jaywalking. You might not feel like someone who jaywalks deserves to pay a ticket for what they have done, but you might feel that people deserve to pay for more serious crimes. For instance, if someone murders another person, you have this feeling that you should pay a penalty for what you've done. We talk about people, for instance, owing a debt to society. And this idea that you should pay for what you've done has been a part of criminal theory of punishment for probably pretty much as long as we've had criminal punishment systems. It goes all the way back to antiquity when Hammurabi derived his eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth code of conduct. And I think that people, especially when you focus on those more serious crimes, you think about, for instance, a child molester. I know people have very strong reactions when they discover or they hear about one person, an adult who's molested a child. And people will say, well, this person deserves to pay for what they've done. They should, and sometimes you'll hear people say stuff like, well, they should, remove his anatomy or various other things that might be done to the person. And basically what this is, when people say this sort of thing, when it's like you should cut off his junk, you might say, Basically, what this is eliciting this kind of intuition that people deserve to pay for what they have done. Another common reason that people enlist when they talk about a justification for criminal punishment is just that punishment deters the criminal from doing the crime again. If you go to jail and you lose your freedom for a couple of years, when you come out, that's going to deter the person who had committed the crime from doing it again. Just like when we punish small children. When I was growing up, I'd get spanked for doing various things, and that would teach me a lesson. I wouldn't do it again. And so this is another common answer that's cited. It's like, well, it's going to prevent this person or hopefully deter them from committing the crime again. Another reason, number 3 up here, is it deters other potential criminals from committing the crime. When I was a small child, I'd see my sister get spanked, and then I'd think, I'm not going to do that action because I don't want to get spanked. And it's the same thing when we talk about criminal punishment. If you lived in a world where no one ever got punished, where someone would steal something and then not get punished, then you would think, well, shoot, I can get away with the crime, and no one ever gets punished, so what's going to stop me? But if you see other people get routinely punished for their crimes, then you're going to think twice. Just like if you're driving down the interstate and you see 5 cops over a 4-mile stretch and they've pulled people and they're writing them tickets, you're going to slow down. But if you don't see cops anywhere when you're driving, probably a lot of people will speed more. So punishing people also, it doesn't deter just the criminal who committed the act, but it also deters other potential criminals. One final thing that people will sometimes say is that punishment, the purpose of it is not just to prevent someone from committing crime, but to hopefully rehabilitate them. To after they get done with their stint in prison, for instance, hopefully they'll be able to come back to society and be a productive member of society. Now, we could argue about the actual effectiveness of rehabilitation programs. As it turns out, they're not terribly effective, but at least this is an ideal of what we're trying to live up to when we punish people. Now, I want you to look at these 4 justifications for punishment right here, and I want you to think very seriously about them. And I want you to ask yourself, could a utilitarian support all of these? Could a utilitarian say, yes, my theory of utilitarianism, it would justify or it would make sense of all of these? And think about this for a second. Does there seem to be any one of these, or maybe 2 or 3, or maybe all of them, that the utilitarian theory doesn't really square with? And hopefully, if you think about this for a second, and you should maybe even pause the presentation and give it some thought of your own before I tell you the answer. Hopefully you'll see, if you haven't already, that a utilitarian couldn't agree with all of these. And in fact, the utilitarian couldn't agree with the very first one listed up here. Why is that? Well, because for the utilitarian, all that matters is, will your actions produce more happiness in the future? Will it lead to some kind of benefit in some way or another for society as a whole? Now, if we look at this right here, punishing a person because it deters the criminal, that could have some positive payoff for society. This right here, deterring other potential criminals, that could also have a positive payoff for society. This one right here, number 4, punishing to rehabilitate. Again, that could have positive payoff for society. But punishing people because they deserve it, that doesn't really have any clear implications for societal benefit. Now, you might say something like, well, it would make the families feel better. And that's something different. And we could list that. We could say the families of a victim make them feel better. That's a different reason, though, we could list up here. But that's not punishing because the person deserves it. That's punishing to make other people happy. And so the first one up here, the first one I have listed, really and truly, when you talk about punishing because someone deserves it, basically what you're giving is what is called a backwards looking reason. You're looking to the past, you're asking what this person did, and now you're trying to punish them based on what they did previously. But these other reasons that I have listed up here, 2, 3, and 4, these are what we call forward-looking reasons. They're asking what potential benefit is going to come about as a result of doing this. Will the punishment lead to greater happiness overall? And if it will, then we should punish someone. So this is what a utilitarian theory is consistent with. Utilitarian justifications don't appeal to what a person deserves. And in fact, utilitarians say we should just abandon this whole idea that we punish people because they deserve it. The people I've known who've been utilitarians, the way they describe this is they say that this is just some kind of medieval holdover of backwards morality, that you're trying to punish someone. It's basically you're just trying to get revenge is all it amounts to. It's this idea, it's like you bashed me, now I'm going to bash you back because blood must have blood. And this is a very primitive Neanderthal way of conducting punishment. It's not a good policy for society because in the end, it has no kind of future benefits whatsoever. Hopefully some of you got my blood must have blood reference. If any of you did, you should shoot me an email and let me know. Anyways, all right, so this is what the utilitarian would say about criminal punishment. Now I want to turn to another issue, and I noticed that a number of you said you were animal lovers when you talked about the things that you consider to be immoral. Some of you said that animal torture is wrong. And I'm curious what you would think about what a utilitarian would say about this. And you can ask yourself very briefly, what do you think a utilitarian would say about, I don't know, using animals in experiments or eating animals, for instance? What would a utilitarian, what do you think they would say? Well, you might on the one hand say, well, if it produced more happiness for people, then the utilitarian would be all for it. But that's not the utilitarian's view, in fact. For the utilitarian, what they're concerned about is happiness, and what they're concerned about is pain. And they don't draw a hard and fast distinction between animal suffering and human suffering, and animal happiness and human happiness. And I think this is something that's really interesting. And to some extent, I think the utilitarian might actually get right. There's a quote here from Jeremy Bentham. He was one of the early pioneers, the very first one who had his body mummified I talked about. And he says this, he says, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" And so for the utilitarian, if we're thinking about eating meat, or we're thinking about performing medical experiments, or anything else, what the utilitarian is going to ask as part of that equation when we're running our cost-benefit analysis is just this. What does the animal suffer? And if the animal suffers, we have to give the animal equal consideration when we're making the determination as to whether or not we should perform a certain action. And again, this goes back to the impartiality requirement I had spoken about before. Remember, for the utilitarian, everybody who can experience pain and suffering gets calculated within the utilitarian calculus when they're trying to make decisions about what to do. Everyone, and I said last class, or the class before maybe, that's true regardless of your race, your religion, your nationality, or your species. For the utilitarian, you can't say, well, it's a dog, so they matter less. Because they're going to say, but they experience pain, they can suffer. And so for that reason, we have to consider their feelings too. Now, in the end, it might turn out that it would produce more overall happiness to do medical experiments on some animals. Maybe we could experiment on a few of them and we could cure cancer, let's just say for the sake of argument. But even if it would produce more overall happiness, we have to give them equal consideration going into the experiment. And if it wouldn't produce more overall happiness, then it would be wrong and immoral to perform any kind of experiment on an animal. We can't simply say things like, well, it's just a dog, it doesn't matter, or it's just a chimpanzee, it doesn't matter, or it's just a bird, it doesn't matter. The utilitarian wouldn't say that at all, because since they can suffer, they get counted. And it's kind of interesting because a number of current utilitarians, what they say is that when we're dismissive of animals' feelings, when we just write them off and say, well, it's just an animal, they don't matter, basically what we're engaging in is a form of prejudice that's very much like racism. And in fact, they call it speciesism. We're preferencing and we're biased towards our species against another species for what they deem to be pretty much arbitrary reasons. And that's why we might say racism is wrong, is because you're prejudiced against a group for an arbitrary reason. But why is it any better to say, well, they're not of my species, so they matter less? They're not of my species, so they're morally less significant. The utilitarian says that makes no sense at all to say that. If they can suffer, they must get counted in the utilitarian calculation. And a good many utilitarians, though not all, are in fact vegetarians, because they say that by eating meat, you're actually producing more pain and suffering in the world. When you eat meat, you have to raise animals in factory farms. You end up slaughtering them, which creates pain. There's a great deal of waste and runoff from factory farming, and so a lot of utilitarians are in fact vegetarians for the simple reason that they think eating animals produces more pain and suffering in the world, and so therefore it would be wrong. So what I hope you can see from this discussion about animal treatment is that for the utilitarian, they're going to factor in and consider the feelings and the happiness and the pain and suffering of animals. And like I said, you have to give their feelings equal consideration to that of humans. You can't simply write it off and say, oh, it's just a dog, so it's less morally significant. The utilitarian is not going to agree with that one bit. So this is the final issue I want to talk about, and this one is pretty heart-wrenching, but it's the issue of what kind of moral duties we should have to people who are suffering from extreme poverty around the world. And I want to just share with you a few important statistics here, because I'm sure that you guys are aware that there are a lot of nations who are just very, very poorly off, and a lot of nations where people struggle just for their very survival. Now, you might not realize how bad it is, though, around the world, so let me just share with you some statistics here. So, approximately 1 billion people live in what is called absolute poverty, and absolute poverty is defined as earning less than $1.25 per day. At least 80% of all humanity lives on less than $10 a day. And think about that for a second. You live on $10 a day, and that's for your clothing, your food, your shelter, everything is less than $10 a day. Going back to the one before that you earn less than $1.25 a day, a cup of coffee at Starbucks costs $2 now. So you couldn't even get that. And then, like I said, 80% of all humanity lives on less than $10 a day. Approximately 6 million children die of hunger each year. Around 28% of all children in developing countries are estimated to be underweight or stunted. That's from lack of nutrition. 50% of children in the world live in poverty. And every year, nearly 11 million children die before their 5th birthday. And when we talk about problems that are associated with extreme poverty, malnutrition is probably the most obvious one, but there are many, many other problems that attend to and accompany extreme poverty. Lack of security, for instance. If your country doesn't have money, then you can't have a police force, you can't have people to protect you, and there are certain parts of the world where people are just murdered left and right in the street because there's just not adequate security in place. Lack of good drinking water. That's a problem in many parts of the world. In India, for instance, people drink water out of the Ganges River, which is also used for cows to go in and cows defecate and urine right in the water that's upstream from where people are drinking directly out of it, or people get water from ditches. In certain parts of the world, people die of malaria because they don't have adequate netting or vaccinations. People die around the world from dysentery, diarrhea. They dehydrate because they don't have medicines for that. And so there are a lot of problems around the world. And the reality is America and Europe and a few other places are they're the exception to how people have lived for the vast majority of human history, and even to some extent how people live today. And so we think about this, and then we consider, how bad some people have it, and we contrast this with how good we have it. Now, I know the United States, not everybody is wealthy, but by comparison, the United States is way better off. And I just want to share with you how the U.S. decides to spend some of its money, U.S. and we could say Europe also. But last year in the U.S., we spent about $8 billion on cosmetics. Ice cream in Europe, about 11 billion was spent. Perfumes in Europe and the US, about 12 billion. Pet foods in Europe and the US, 17 billion. And I want to just comment on the pet foods. I was up late one night and I saw a commercial for diet dog food. And that just really hit a chord with me because it got me thinking. It's like, wow, in some parts of the world, people die of starvation. 11 million children yearly die of starvation. And in the United States, we have so much food that even our pets are overweight. Think about that for a second. Business entertainment in Japan, $35 billion. Cigarettes in Europe, 50 billion. Alcoholic drinks in Europe, 105 billion. And military spending in the world, 780 billion. And when you see these numbers and you contrast them with how badly off many people are in parts of the world, this raises some interesting questions as to what moral obligations, if any, do we have to help people in these countries? Are we morally required to sacrifice our luxuries in order to help these people? Are we morally required to diminish even our needs in certain ways to help these people? Do we do something, on the other hand, do we do something immoral if we help people? And some people would argue that we do something immoral by helping others. Some people would argue that we have no obligations whatsoever. Some people would argue that we're morally required to do much more than we do. So you can see here there are various positions that people take. On the one hand, some people say we're morally required to help. And then once you ask, well, are you morally required to help? You might ask, well, how much are you morally required to help these people? Some people would say, no, you're not morally required whatsoever. You can have as many luxuries as you want, and those other people can starve to death, and you have no obligation to them at all. Then other people still would say that you do something wrong by helping. And, different people come to this with different ideas in mind. What I want to do is I want to ask, well, what would the utilitarian say? And my guess is that the utilitarian view is going to be somewhat similar to what some of you would say, but it also might be a little different. And even if it does line up with what some of you might say, it might do so for different reasons than what you previously thought. So we're going to turn to this and ask, what would a utilitarian say about our duties to help people in dire poverty? Figuring out what a utilitarian would say when it comes to our duties to help those who are suffering from extreme poverty is actually somewhat of a complicated matter. All that's important, though, when we're trying to make our decision is whether or not our action will lead to more overall happiness or more overall pain. And so this is going to be motivated or guided by the exact same kind of guidelines that guided our previous decisions when we talked about the legalization of marijuana, or we talked about our duties to animals, or we talked about criminal punishment. The utilitarian is thinking, what's going to produce the big picture, most overall happiness? And just like the other kinds of things we talked about, we have to do a cost-benefits analysis. Now, before we get to something as complex as talking about helping entire nations or sending aid and things like that to nations, I want to just focus on one simple example, or I shouldn't say simple, but a simplified example, to give you an idea of how complicated this is, and also to tell you and show you how a utilitarian would approach making a decision about this. So let's imagine that you're going to see your new favorite movie that's coming out, or you hope it's going to be your favorite movie. It's a new Avengers movie or a new Star Wars movie. And you're on your way to the theater and you see a child who's starving. He's sitting on the sidewalk. He's covered in filth. And you realize that this child needs help. And you're confronted with a decision you have to make. You could go see your movie and use the $10 for the movie, or you could use the $10 to save the child's life. Now, I realize it's never going to be this cut and dry in the real life. I realize that chances are also that you could do both, that you have enough money for both. But let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, this was your last $10 you would allocate it for any kind of discretionary spending for entertainment and this sort of thing. And you were making the choice, well, do I go see this movie or should I save this child's life? Let's suppose it was that cut and dry. I think most everybody in this situation would say you should save the kid's life. I mean, if giving up a movie, and let's say you couldn't see it again, like next week, let's say this was your last chance to ever see this movie. I think even still, people would say, well, what you should do is you should you should save the kid's life and just miss your movie. Too bad. But the utilitarian is going to approach this in a very different way. And what you're going to have to do, like everything else, is you're going to have to run a kind of cost-benefit analysis. And so you're going to have to consider all kinds of things. So one thing that you'll have to consider is my pleasure and pain. Because not getting to see your movie, especially if it's one, that might seem kind of trivial, but some people really, they get into the movies, they're movie lovers, this is their hobby, their thing they do, and especially if you've been waiting for a movie for a long, long time and you really are anxious to see it, this could be something that makes you sad. Now, it's not going to be like sad, hopefully not like your mother died sad, but it is going to be a little upsetting that you don't get to see your movie. So the utilitarian would say you need to consider that, your pleasure and pain. But you also have to consider the child's pain and pleasure, right? And who's going to suffer more here? Well, there's a level of sadness that I will experience from not getting to see my movie, but then there's also a level of sadness this child is going to experience as he or she slowly starves to death. And so you'd have to weigh and measure those against one another. In addition to that, and this might seem very small by comparison, but again, the utilitarian says you have to consider the aggregate consequences of your actions. And so you'd have to consider, for instance, how it's going to affect the movie theater and other businesses. The movie theater, again, I mean, they make money off ticket sales. So if you don't go in, that's going to be $10 less that they receive. Now, in the grand scheme of things, $10 doesn't matter a whole lot. But along the same lines, you'd have to consider how it affects other people. And what if my action were to spawn a revolution, let's say? What if other people saw me do this and they said, hey, I want to do the same thing? If that were the case, then a lot of people might stop going to see movies. And if that were the case, then people who work at the movie theaters, they would lose their jobs. And if they lost their jobs, then you'd have more people out on the streets. And now I know this is a preposterous chain of events that could occur here, but what the utilitarian says is that you have to consider those kinds of long-term consequences of your actions. And you have to be thinking, again, big picture. You can't just focus on the immediate decision before you with the child and you and your movie. You have to think, well, who else could possibly be affected by this? What are the long-term possible ramifications? And so you see here, just focusing on one little simple action, like even just giving $10 to a starving child, it's a very complex matter. And it's going to be much, much more complex when we turn to things such as donating money to entire nations or donating resources to entire nations. Things get much, much more complicated very, very quickly.